You cannot change what you don't measure. So the point of this is if you start getting carcass data back, find out what your calves are doing, you can increase the value of those cattle by maybe making some changes. Yes, sir.
I've asked for it, and there's only one national beef is the only one that's ever given me feedback on how they killed it.
You know, you can, and it's a shame. As an industry, we should be better at that, because I think that trend is going to get better, because what's happening now, there's a lot more beef that's sold on the rail now. And because of that, cattle that feed good, the demand for those calves that feed well is increasing, which means that although they're not going to share that information, there's going to be more activity on a set of calves that feed better. And vice versa is true. If the calves don't feed good, you're going to have less activity. But what you got to do, and I don't know if you video calves or however you sell, but whoever buys those cattle, you need to tell them, I need carcass data back.
Well, I've sold to Bartlett feeders there in Kansas, and I told my salesman or my buyer he can't get it from the packers.
They have that on every cut sheet that they make.
And he only got them from National. He sold them to National, and they were willing to give it to him, but everybody else, they won't give it.
We have to fix that, because how can you change what you need to do unless you know what your benchmarks are? You have to know what your calves are doing. And see, that's part of the thing that bugs me about it, because we have a lot of good cattle out there that feed really well. And yet, nobody is willing to share that information with the folks that are producing those calves, which to me seems silly. Because, and I know why, obviously, if your calves feed out better than anybody else's, they don't want any other buyer to know that. Because then you're going to say, no, I got to have a little more from my calves. You guys.
Some of the feeders won't even communicate how well your calves fed.
Yeah.
What their gain was and how much.
You know,
And all that.
and we're going to try to, like here in New Mexico, we're going to try to revamp that ranch to rail deal a little bit. Dr. Gifford has been trying to set it up and work on it to where we can start sending some calves, and through this New Mexico certified calf deal, that's part of what they're trying to do, is take a portion of those calves and go to a ranch to rail program. And he's got deals with feeders and a harvest plant, and I can't remember who it was. It's over around, maybe it's West Texas. I believe it's going to harvest those calves so that we do get all the information back, and to be able to share that with producers. And so you just take a little handful of those calves and you feed them and get them onto this test and find out what do they do. Because to me, that's pretty powerful to be able to say, nah, you know, my calves are doing better than that. And that's part of the quality deal, you know? Yes?
Is there any data in the state of New Mexico or maybe here in Texas or Colorado that for certain, that we know for certain that do cooperate? Like for example, the model he's having, that, you know, created data, you know?
From a selling standpoint, there's been several research projects that accumulate video sales data to show, like for instance, calves that have been backgrounded, what do they receive, you know, all these different value-added programming. There's lots of data for that to show what is the value of doing these things to calves that your video sell. So far as carcass data, there's not really accumulation of data anywhere in particular for that at this point. Yeah.
They're not going to share it with us. Why would we want to do business with them? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I am not aware of any database where you can go and look and see which buyers will make sure you get carcass data back. I know some producers that have, I don't know whether they've argued long enough or not, but they do get carcass data back after those cattle have been fed out. Yep, no, you're right. But yes, sir. Yeah.
So we go to our feeders, and that gives us direct data on the individual cattle.
Uh-huh.
So it helped us because it isn't an inheritable trait to be able to come to now where we're 85% yields because of genetics. And that growth savings, I don't know what it costs us, but it sure helped.
Yeah, and see, I know some producers down in, I'm from the Silver City area, and I know there's a guy down there that just put one in, and the reason is because he's always felt like his cattle feed well, and especially for, he's got kind of a drouthy old deal, and so residual feed intake is a pretty important component of that, and he's fed them cattle for I think 2 years now, and it's helped him. So.
Typically the way they do that is they got a pin of cow.
Yep.
And they feed that to the cow.
Yep.
And then they average that
Yep.
to the cow.
Yes.
Well, to be able to get the genetics part of it, goal A probably fed out a hell of a lot better than goal C. But goal C got the same grade because it was average.
Yes.
And now with the genetics, we can cut goal C out.
Yes.
Go to goal A and get better genetics.
Yep.
It's been a good deal.
Yes, Ed?
But all that's going to require an education tax to be tracked by hand, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, basically, one of the big keys, which is part of why third-party verification is becoming more important, is because of the ability to track an animal individually all the way through is becoming more important from a verification standpoint and from a data gathering standpoint. Yeah. So, quality and yield grades can work against each other because obviously, if you feed them enough to grade them, you may take a hickey on the yield grade end of things. So it's all trying to hit the middle. There's targets that we have, and the reason is that they have suggested targets is because if you look at the wholesalers of meat, they sell steaks in a box. And so they want to fit the meat to the box because this guy wants 12-ounce New York steaks, this particular restaurant, that are high choice. And they have to be of a certain size. Now they can get a 12-ounce ribeye or a 12-ounce, let's use ribeye for an example. They can get a 12-ounce ribeye, they can do that. But how thick do you have to cut one if the ribeye on that animal is an 18-inch ribeye? All of a sudden, you're talking a much thinner piece of meat, and it doesn't fit the box. Well, us folks in the beef industry, we tend to be a little picky about how we cook meat, especially when we're talking about a good steak. We're pretty careful with them. But what does the average consumer do? If you stop and think about it, a lot of steak is consumed on Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening around a cooler watching a football game, right? And if they're doing that, how careful are they about cooking that steak? If that steak is this thick, are they going to screw it up? Likely. If it's this thick, the margin of error is much greater. So they want that steak to be of a particular size because consistency in the rest of the industry from wholesalers forward makes a huge difference. They want to be able to consistently supply a ribeye that's of a certain size because most consumers want a 4 to 6 ounce piece of meat, which is a little bigger than the palm of their hand. That's what they want. That's what the consumer wants. What do we want? We want one that's this thick and about like that, right? That's not what the average consumer wants. And so wholesalers want it to fit the box, and therefore there's targets. And of course, especially there for a while when we were short of numbers and we got into this exotic breeding stuff and we were breeding keys and all this other stuff, then pretty soon our carcasses were too long for our kill plants. And they're having that difficulty now that a lot of our carcasses are getting so big that when they hang those, the shanks may touch the ground. And that doesn't work because they don't want to retool that plant to get bigger carcasses. So what they're doing is they don't want them. They don't have value. So that's kind of the quality of the meat that we're talking about. I'm going to talk a little bit about working with your veterinarian. Obviously, I'm biased. I am a veterinarian, therefore I think you should work with them. I have grandkids. My grandkids have needs, you know, so obviously I want you to use veterinarians. There's things that we're required for. You know, there's a lot of regulatory actions that occur that we need to be present for. A lot of times we know kind of what's going on around in the country. We have an idea of things that are happening. And then we're also needed for emergencies. This is where I tell people, you know, it was easy for me to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go pull a calf on somebody that I work a lot with. It's pretty hard to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go pull a calf from somebody that it was 4 years ago at 2 o'clock in the morning when I saw them. And the worst part of it is they exhaust every opportunity for me to have success, because the only reason I'm involved is they could not get it out. And then it's a disaster for me. I would rather be involved much quicker to where I have a chance of giving them a live, hopefully a live calf, but certainly a live heifer at the end of the deal. And so having a relationship with your veterinarian is important, especially nowadays, which I'll explain here in a second. So this is the Ranch to Rail program that we had for a while in New Mexico, and this is 4 years worth of data, and this is a slide to show you there's one thing that makes, and this is still true today, the number one factor on whether feeders make money or not is the health of the calf. Health is the number one driver whether that animal is profitable or not, or the major driver. There are obviously lots of factors that go into it, health being number one. And I've talked to feed yard managers and they tell me if they never treat them, they make money. If they treat them one time, they lose. That's all it takes. One treatment and they will not make money off that calf. That's how much it matters. And this is an accumulation of 4 years worth of data. The net income off of healthy calves. Now this looks pretty accurate, right? This is ranching in New Mexico, right? You made 13 bucks a head on those calves. If they got sick, you lost 114. So does health matter? Absolutely. You got to know what you're treating for. Does this one need a shot of antibiotics? Well, depends. You got to know. And especially, how many of you heard the term antimicrobial resistance? Have you heard about that in the news? It's a big deal now. That's another soapbox I won't get into because there's so much misinformation in that deal that it's crazy. But so how should you treat? You got to know what you're treating for. You got to know the effectiveness of the drug. We cannot, absolutely cannot make antibiotic decisions based on, this crap expired 2 years ago, I better use it up because I don't want to throw it away. That's not how we pick the antibiotic that we want to use. We choose the antibiotic based upon what we think, hopefully with your veterinarian's input, what is the most likely cause of this problem and which antibiotic has the greatest efficacy against that particular bug. That's how the decision should be made. The economics should have to be considered, but really what we should look at is what gives me the best chance to cure this animal, because that gives me the best chance to recover economically on that animal. And sometimes it's better that we don't. That particular photograph, if that's all I knew about that calf and it was early in the morning, would I treat that calf? Probably not. It's a pretty clear nasal discharge. It's probably it. Heck, it may be nothing, or it may be viral. What antibiotic works against viruses? None, right? I mean, there are other products that do help, but why don't antibiotics kill a virus? Any idea? Where do viruses live? They don't live inside the body, they live inside a cell. So they're not exposed to the antibiotic. Bacteria, other infections, like bacterial infections, they live outside the body. I mean, inside the body, but outside of the cells. They're in systems, they're circulating, they're in blood, they're in all fluids, all this stuff. Antibiotics can get to them. Antibiotics can't get to a virus because they're intracellular. They go inside the cell and they use that cell's own machinery. They plug themselves into that machinery to make more virus. That's why here's a side note that I'll say, that's why modified live vaccines are an absolute necessity somewhere in your health program. You need to visit with your veterinarian about using them, because if you never expose your calves to a modified live virus, they will never develop the immune system they need. It cannot happen. And the reason is, to flip a switch on a particular portion of the immune system that's called cell-mediated immunity, it requires that virus to replicate inside that cell. And if that doesn't happen, they never turn on the cell-mediated immune portion of their immune system. So if the only thing they ever see are killed products, they never flip that switch. So when they go to a place where they're commingled, they're at a disadvantage, because there's a portion of their immune system that won't be included. So you got to talk to your veterinarian, and you have to include modified lives in your program. So over the counter, what does that mean? That means you can go buy them anywhere, right? You can go to the feed store and buy some. And I'm going to talk about antibiotics particularly, but there's lots of other things, but antibiotics especially. Do you know what the number one residue is in beef cattle detected at the harvest plant? Number one is penicillin. Why penicillin? It's over the counter, yeah. Because people can go buy it and use it without oversight. And because of that, is it used properly? In most cases not. And the problem with it is out here in New Mexico, in most of the groups that I talk to, folks are pretty savvy. I mean, we're cattle folks. But you got to look at the majority. What's the average herd size in the United States?
12.
It's about 30 cows. So if somebody has 30 cows, that's the average. That's average. If somebody has 30 cows, do you think they're up on all the latest animal health, what information and all that? Heck, most of those calves, I talked to the guy that owns the Joplin, Missouri feed yard, which is the largest, or not feed yard, but sale barn, largest sale barn in the United States. And he was telling me that he sends Christmas cards to his clients every year. He sends over 13,000 Christmas cards every year. But his clients sell 3 calves, 2 calves. And those folks, they don't castrate, they don't dehorn, they don't do any of that. So if it's sick, what do? They go to the coffee shop and ask Joe, what do you give them? Oh, you go to the feed store and you get your bottle of penicillin. Just give him a big old slug of penicillin, it'll fix him. And so it's not used properly. That's why it's what's the number 2 residue, by the way? Anybody have any idea? Banamine. Banamine is the number 2. And that's tough for us to justify, because Banamine can only be given IV, except now there's a pour-on that's just been labeled to use Banamine in cattle for the pain and inflammation associated with foot rot, and I can't remember what it's labeled for exactly. It's not labeled for dehorning yet. Dehorning and castration, for the pain associated with dehorning and castration. But the problem with it is now all of a sudden we have a pain reliever that's labeled for use in food animals or labeled for use in cattle. So what does that do to the products that we've been using? We can't use them anymore, because part of the burden with extra label drug use is we can only use drugs if there are no alternatives. Now there's an alternative. Prescription drugs require a veterinarian's prescription. I think y'all are pretty well with that. Failure to know the labeling requirements is not a defense if meat from one of your animals is found to contain a drug residue. Not knowing the law doesn't matter. Not observing the withdrawal or not realizing there was a withdrawal. Everything you give to a food animal has a withdrawal. Everything. The question, and there's some products that the withdrawal is 0, but if it's 0, it has to state it on the label. Everything has a withdrawal. Extra label drug use. Extra label or off-label use of drugs is to use it in a way that varies from the label directions in any form or manner. That means species, indications. You know, penicillin's not labeled for diarrhea, but if you give them a shot of penicillin, you're using that drug extra label. It's not labeled for all these drugs, they have different label indications. And if it doesn't say, like I was just talking about, Banamine is for the pain and inflammation associated with foot rot. I know that's on the label, I can't remember, but I know that pain and castration and dehorning isn't. So if you give a dose of Banamine, oh, it's fever was the other thing, which obviously is why we tend to use Banamine as fever. But the point is if you use it for the pain with dehorning, that's extra label because it's not on the label. Or what about the route? If it says you to be given IM and you give it sub-Q, that's extra label. So who can give a drug extra label? It's your animal and you go buy it, can you vary from the label? The answer is no. It is a violation of law. The only way you can use a drug extra label is if a veterinarian inside the context of a valid veterinary client-patient relationship instructs you to do so. And if we dispense a medication with extra label use, for extra label use, we have to put an additional label on that bottle that carries an extra label claim on it. And the reason is that only a veterinarian inside this veterinary client-patient relationship is the only one that can instruct extra label. And there are certain things that I can't do extra label. Even as a veterinarian, I can't use them. I don't know how many of you ever heard of the drug Baytril. Baytril is a pretty good drug. Do you know it is prohibited by law to be used in food animals? Except as labeled. You can only use it on label, including veterinarians. Well, that's a pretty narrow scope in which you can use Baytril. But Baytril is not